The blue flame from Charles's sword burned Elliot's body to ashes. Lena looked at her brother's expressionless face and wanted to comfort him, but she didn't know how. She knew how painful Elliot's betrayal must have been for Charles, but she felt powerless to do anything about it. After a long silence, she said, "I know it will take some time for me to learn everything I need to know, but I will try my best to improve my skills so you don't have to protect me." Between being held hostage by Haley and watching Charles deal with the betrayal of his friend, her heart ached. She was young and inexperienced, so she struggled to understand the complexity of human behavior. But she did understand one thing. If she didn't know how to protect herself, then she would only be a burden to Charles. Once again, despite having developed some paranormal abilities, she'd been forced to watch from the sidelines, and she hated feeling so powerless. She didn't want her brother to have to keep protecting her. Charles smiled and said, "I know you'll work it out." What he feared the most was that his sister would walk the same path he had in his previous life. Since it had led to him losing everything, he didn't want Lena to repeat his mistakes. Tina and the others did a sweep of the monsters lying scattered around them, removing the crystal cores from their heads and handing them to Charles. As he took them, Charles said, "If you want anything, you can use these cores as currency. Later I will drop a detailed price list for you. Whether it is food, clean water, medicine, or clothes, you can exchange these cores for them." One man's eyes lit up as he called out, "Can I exchange them for a submachine gun?" At that, everyone grew excited. Charles nodded. "Of course you can, but I don't recommend it. Those kinds of guns require a lot of practice to master. Otherwise, they can be dangerous and even useless." Alice pointed at the captives on the ground and asked, "How should we deal with these people?" Everyone turned to look at them. Now that the monsters had been dealt with, they knew they had to discuss what to do with the captives. Alice understood Charles quite well by this point, so she knew their captives were unlikely to survive. As if on cue, the captives started to panic and cry out, "Spare me! We surrender! We know a lot of things. Just spare our lives!" Charles ignored them and turned back to his team. "These people are from Stellar Technology, where they're conducting human experiments, so it's better to let the military handle them. I'm sure the army will give them a fair trial." Alice gaped at him, not believing the military would be at all impartial. But before she could say anything, Tina said firmly, "It would be the right thing to do. The military is better equipped to deal with them, and they should be made aware of what's going on." Alice shrugged, uncaring about what happened to their captives. Charles also didn't care about the lives of these people. All he cared about was Stellar Technology. He hated them, and he was determined to gain access to what they had in their laboratory. Of course, Stellar Technology had used their knowledge to commit many crimes, but even the military couldn't do anything about it. Charles, however, was determined to stop them. After all, his goal was to build a safe shelter for everyone, and there was no point in being a leader of people living among ruins. He wanted to create a decent place to call home, somewhere they could all live in peace. After having decided the fate of his captives, Charles warned them, "Don't try to play any tricks. What you know is too important, and we won't let you go. There will be no begging for leniency. If you don't tell us what we need to know, then even if the army does let you go, I will find you, and you won't like what happens then." The prisoners started calling out to him, trying to protect themselves. "I swear, we won't try anything. We'll tell you everything we know. Yes, we know all about Stellar Technology, and we promise not to hide anything from you." The mere idea that Charles would hunt them down had them trembling with fear. It would be safer for them to stay in prison than to be at the mercy of such a man. Charles used a suppression amulet to prevent anyone from escaping, and then he had the captives thrown into cars. He instructed Alice and Sylvie to watch them while the others collected some supplies before they left. Lena also wanted to go. Charles hesitated for a moment, and then he nodded his agreement. Since the vicinity had been mostly cleared of danger, it should be safe for his sister to be by his side, and it would be a good opportunity for him to continue teaching her. Charles and his team spent the next couple of hours stocking up on provisions. Since they already had plenty of food, Charles focused on filling his energy storage space with clothes and medicines. Once they had scavenged everything in the area, they all left together in the vehicles. When they had arrived, they had only been in possession of 2 vehicles, but after having taken those belonging to their captives, they had 7. When their convoy appeared at the city gate, it attracted the attention of the patrolling army, the Neal family, and everyone else in the city. "Is the army bringing in some survivors again?" one woman asked, craning her neck to see what was happening. No, I don't think so, her companion said. I heard that survivors were being sent to some of the other fortresses that were under construction. Everyone be careful, a soldier said, looking through his binoculars. Those aren't just big trucks, they're armored vehicles. Consequently, numerous fully armed soldiers surrounded the convoy. A familiar-looking man stepped out in front of the cars. Listen up, people, he called. Tell us your purpose for coming here and cooperate with our inspection. Otherwise, we will be forced to view you as an enemy and act accordingly. Charles smiled. Tony, how have you been? Tony was stunned when he saw Charles getting out of the armored vehicle. He knew Charles had taken a group of people out of the city to collect some supplies, but he hadn't expected them to come back in armored vehicles. Briefly, he wondered if they had stolen them from an army, but then he dismissed the idea. Despite recognizing Charles, Tony still didn't tell his men to stand down. Charles, he said, although I trust you, it's military protocol that you tell me where you got these vehicles. Charles just smiled back at him and said, Don't worry, I'll cooperate. He gestured to his people, who started unloading firearms and other weapons out of the vehicles. The military personnel realized the seriousness of the situation. Charles had returned on the same day he had left, and considering the time he had to have spent collecting the resources, he couldn't have gone very far. That meant there had to be a powerful terrorist organization hiding nearby. As Charles unloaded the armored vehicles and captives for inspection, the crowd watched and muttered to each other, What the hell's going on? Is that the infamous Dawn Alliance? I heard they were out looking for food. I didn't expect them to come back armed to the teeth. I want to join the Alliance too. What makes you think they'll accept you? I heard that the condition for joining is very simple, and yet highly dangerous. Apparently you have to go out of the city with them to fight monsters. I don't know much about their leader, but judging by the number of weapons he's confiscated, he must be very powerful. Following him should offer a certain degree of security. Why don't we give it a try? Charles had moved the weapons on purpose to flex his muscles and improve his reputation. Although it could be an effective strategy in the short term, he knew that the people watching him would be unreliable in the face of danger. Such recruits would likely either be weak or soldiers with evil intentions. Bringing back these weapons was an excellent opportunity to get more publicity. His ability to go out for such a short time, and yet come back with so many guns, made him look like a true leader. His performance at the abandoned mall would also have enhanced his reputation. After all, he had inspired his team to fight against armed men, and none of them had rebelled against their orders. By displaying his strength and his ability to command, their trust in him had increased, and that bolstered the Dawn Alliance's reputation as well as his own. Once the inspection had been completed, Tony took Charles aside for a private discussion. He was alarmed by Charles's growing influence, as he feared it could destabilize the fortress. As the Alliance grew more and more powerful, the army's influence might shrink. Charles listened to his concerns, and then he said, I don't think I've had too much of a negative impact on the fortress. In fact, I think I can be of help with some of the dangers we face. Tony had to admit that he was right. Although Charles was occasionally disruptive, he had contributed a lot to the success of the fortress. We know you haven't done anything dishonest, he said, but there are people who are worried about your growing influence. Charles replied, There's no need. Tony knew Charles hadn't really done anything illegal, so the army couldn't arrest him. It would reflect badly on them if they turned against him after all his help. Of course, Charles's possession of the firearms could be considered a crime, but honestly, nobody could blame Charles for seizing weapons that could potentially be used against the fortress. Charles understood the difficult position the army was in. He smiled and said, You will soon understand that the bad influence I might have on your men is nothing compared to the dangers we face out there. Tony frowned. What do you mean? Charles pointed at the guns and asked, Don't you want to know where these things came from? Don't you wonder why these armored vehicles are disguised as trucks? Don't you care what their original owners were planning to do with them? We have people interrogating the captives, Tony told him. We'll soon have the answers to those questions. Charles replied, I have plenty of insights to offer you on the matter. I can help you to determine if they are telling the truth. Charles didn't hold back. He told Tony everything he knew about stellar technology, including the things he had surmised for himself. As Tony and his commanders realized the extent of the force's stellar technology was building up, they grew furious. They hadn't expected someone to have the audacity to build such a company near their military district. Not to mention the fact they were carrying out human experiments that were forbidden under international law. It was simply insane. But they didn't doubt Charles was telling them the truth, and when Tony had heard everything Charles had to say, he turned to the man beside him and said, "Go and tell the person in charge of the interrogation to use torture if necessary. I want details, and I want them as soon as possible. I will report this to the top level and let them decide." Using torture to interrogate a criminal was usually frowned upon, but in these circumstances, an exception would be made. If what Charles had said was true, then this was a security concern at the highest level. A little while later, Tony approached Charles. "I heard that your parents have made a breakthrough in their research," he said, his expression serious. "Thanks to the research data you found, they've developed a zombie serum. It can help those who've been bitten by a zombie, and even though its effects are still limited, it's a huge step forward." It was great news, but Charles knew he would have to keep it as a secret, as it was classified information. "Really?" he asked. "Can I have a batch of it?" He knew the serum could help him solidify his position and further increase the loyalty of his followers. After all, being bitten by medicinal zombies was normally fatal, but with this type of serum, he could encourage more people to take up the fight. "Of course you can," Tony said. "This is your parents' work, and they've asked us to give you all the credit. We will give you the first batch of 36 sets. That's the same share that the military will receive." Charles nodded. He had thought it would take a long time for him to gain the trust of the military, but it seemed the process had been greatly accelerated thanks to his parents. "You're a smart person, and I believe you understand what you should or shouldn't do with this serum," Tony said. "My superiors have decided not to restrict your influence, and they will even support you in secret. But I hope you will retain your moral code." "I am not a particularly ambitious man," Charles said. Tony stretched out his right hand. "Then I trust we shall remain close partners." Charles took his hand and replied, "I'm sure we will." When the situation eventually worsened, he would no longer worry about his relationship with the military. After all, his actions were nothing compared to the dangers that lay ahead. When everyone saw Charles leading his team, who were carrying their cache of guns and ammunition, not to mention their food supplies, they were shocked. As they watched, they began to discuss the matter among themselves. "Damn, doesn't the army care about guns anymore?" "Why should they care? Crime is getting more serious every day, and people are stealing food from each other because they don't have enough for themselves. It can't be stopped without proper punishments for offenders. The Dawn Alliance has a strong backing, and their leader is really powerful. Why don't we join them? Yeah, let's do it." Many people had already been interested in joining the Dawn Alliance, but Charles's appearance with all these weapons had them all fired up. As a result, the number of people applying to join kept increasing. Charles delegated the matter to someone else, telling them, "I can't take too many people out with me every time, and in the future, the profits from every trip will belong to me. I will also take half of what everyone else brings back. If the stronger members have to take the weaker ones with them, then they should be compensated for doing so." In any case, these people wouldn't dare to leave the city if it wasn't for Charles, and even if they did leave, more than half of them would die without protection, so he felt he was being perfectly fair. "Aren't you going to delegate the responsibility for them to the other leaders?" Tina asked. "Even if the others are under their command, they can still give you the resources." In her opinion, Charles was too tolerant of those other leaders who wanted to club together and reap all the rewards. They were already too powerful, so she did not understand why Charles allowed them to take so much. Charles wasn't offended by her comment, and instead asked, "If I don't keep them happy, then why would they follow me? You'll understand this one day. To maintain the loyalty of your subordinates, you must give them every reason to stay." He was making himself indispensable to the others so that they wouldn't betray him. Only then could he build up his forces properly. After sending his subordinates to do their work, Charles invited Alice and Sylvia into his house. Once inside, Charles told them, "Wait here, I have to deal with a traitor, and then I'll be right back." Then he slipped out of the window and disappeared. The rest of the team members returned to their homes, while a mysterious figure quietly headed toward the Neal family's quarters. Sebastian watched as David entered the Neal family's villa and approached him. "How's the investigation going?" he asked. When David hesitated, Sebastian narrowed his eyes. "Speak your mind," he ordered. "You're free to say whatever you like to me." Earlier, when Charles had decided to engage the enemy, David had fought alongside him. "Charles has grown powerful," he reported. "It would be better not to oppose him. If you do, you might put the entire Neal family in danger." Sebastian shook his head. "You're only saying that because you don't fully understand the power of the Neal family. After the world changed, all those who have cultivated martial arts have become terrifyingly powerful. A mere paranormal is nothing to be afraid of. David sighed, knowing it wasn't his place to decide if Charles was a friend or an enemy. All he needed to do was report the facts. If the Neal family weren't afraid of Charles's power, then perhaps Sebastian was right, and he had underestimated them. Sebastian had been listening to David's report, but then suddenly David collapsed to the floor and lay still. When Sebastian looked closer, he realized David had been shot and was no longer breathing. He hadn't even heard the shot. A sniper, he thought. His mind went blank for a moment, and then he rushed to hide behind a cabinet. But despite waiting for what felt like a long time, no second bullet arrived. Summoning his courage, he carefully emerged from his hiding place, and after making sure the shooter was gone, he shouted, "I want that sniper found now!" His staff rushed around in all directions, searching for the killer. But before long, they determined that the immediate area surrounding the house was clear, which meant that the sniper had to have pulled the trigger from some distance away. After some more investigation, Sebastian discovered that the shooter had fired from the rooftop of a building, leaving traces behind, meaning they were unlikely to be a professional sniper. "Not a professional?" Sebastian roared. "You're telling me that a sniper who can shoot a target from that far away isn't a professional?" "Why don't we call the army and let them investigate?" asked one of his men. "The military maintains tight control over firearms in the city, so they'll want to know about this." Sebastian scowled at him. "You want me to call the army and ask them to investigate? Don't you know who our real enemy is? Charles is just a pawn for the military. Our real opponent is the military itself. If I ask the military to help us solve this problem, what do you think they will do to me?" The man lowered his head, not daring to say anything else. After a while, Sebastian said, "Forget it. Leave this matter to Charles and let him figure it out." After killing David, Charles didn't hang around to see what would happen. It was true that he wasn't a professional marksman, but he had honed his mental willpower in the post-apocalyptic era, and he could easily become proficient with any weapon. Upon returning to his room, Charles began to comfort Alice, who was worried about there having been a traitor on their team. Although Alice was annoyed that Charles had left with little explanation, she calmed down once he explained. "There was a traitor on our team?" she asked, shocked. Charles nodded. "It was David. When I told him to hide at the back of the mall, he chose an excellent spot, and he held his knife in a very professional way. That's how I knew." "I really didn't see that coming," Alice said. "Who was he working for?" Charles's eyes filled with hatred. The Neal family. If the Neal family had sent someone to spy on him, then that meant they were probably preparing to attack. It was time to decide what they were going to do about it. Over the next 3 days, Charles took his team out in batches to collect resources, demonstrating his strength and his ability to make decisions. Everyone knew that all kinds of monsters were out there, but when they teamed up with Charles, they believed their safety was guaranteed. Only one unlucky man was careless enough to be bitten by a zombie, and Charles used that as an opportunity to show off his zombie serum, saving the man in front of everyone. News of the incident quickly spread throughout the fortress, raising Charles's reputation to an even higher level. Rumors started to circulate. "A zombie serum? Does that mean that being bitten no longer means certain death? I heard that someone in the military is also using a zombie serum. Charles really is from the military, isn't he?" Charles didn't intend to clarify this misunderstanding, because he still needed to use the military's influence. More preparation would be needed before he was truly independent. After Charles's zombie serum was common knowledge, a few of the other Alliance leaders came to see him. Charles was direct with them. "I won't give you something for nothing, but you can trade for it. You can give me food, water, or the corpses of monsters. It's up to you." Olivia and the other leaders brought out a few items and made an exchange. But anyone else who wanted some of the serum was refused. After all, Charles was not a philanthropist, and there wasn't enough serum to go around. Even if people were unhappy about that, there was nothing he could do. A while later, Olivia came back. This time she was alone. Charles looked at her. "Aren't you afraid the others will find out you came back?" He was the most influential person in the Alliance. If the others didn't work together, then Charles would take control. At a time like this, Olivia visiting Charles alone could easily cause a misunderstanding. Olivia gave him a bitter smile. "I can see that this alliance will eventually be yours to command. This world changes so quickly, and you are the one who is most adaptable to the new rules." In the beginning, she had some doubts about Charles's actions. But what had happened in the last few days had made her understand that Charles had planned everything. He had known exactly what he was doing. After all, Charles was an opportunist, always quick to adapt to his circumstances and arrange everything for his own benefit. The world has changed, he agreed. What people lack is security. Those who have their humanity are also devoured by their fear, so they gather around the strong looking for protection. It's human instinct. Olivia frowned. Lately, there have been many paranormals taking people out to search for supplies, but in the entire fortress, you're the one who brings back the most things and of the widest variety, and you bring back most of your team alive. Now the entire alliance wants to follow you. She sighed. I will also follow you. In the last 3 days, the survivors have become increasingly aware of the importance of finding supplies, but the dangers in the outside world made them shrink back. They needed a strong leader, and they believed Charles was that leader. So Olivia had come to surrender to him, knowing she couldn't defeat him. Charles smiled. You've made the right choice, but I don't need you to do anything special. Just pretend that nothing has happened. The Alliance still needs to be expanded, but we need to monitor the loyalty of its members and ensure no one else wants to betray us. Olivia nodded. In other words, you want me to be a spy and infiltrate ranks. Charles shook his head. No, there's no need for that. As time goes by, they will understand me better. We don't want our members fighting among themselves. I understand, Olivia said. It seems you really do know much more than I do. She had always known that, but she hadn't realized quite how much smarter he was. Apparently, Charles was much better at guessing the future than she was. Charles said, if you have time, then perhaps you can help me find some outstanding paranormals. But don't worry about subduing them. I'll take care of it. Olivia thought for a while. Then she said hesitantly, speaking of outstanding paranormals, my cousin is very powerful, and her strength has already reached the peak of Tier 3. There are also a few other powerful paranormals with her. What's her name? Charles asked. Her name is Miranda, Olivia said. She became a paranormal after receiving surgery. What? Charles's eyes widened. Then he asked anxiously, what about the paranormals with her? Is there an earth element? Also a light element, a fire element, and a necromancer? He looked at Olivia again, realizing her appearance and temperament were somewhat similar to Miranda's. Olivia blanked. How do you know that? Have you ever seen her before? Do you have some kind of grudge against her? Alice had been listening outside, and she rushed in and blurted out, Miranda is your cousin? Where is she? Take us to find her. Olivia narrowed her eyes. How do you know my cousin? Charles just smiled and said, it's a small world. Your cousin and I went to the same school.
Olivia was still wary of Charles, but once he had explained everything, she finally let down her guard. She had to admit that if Charles hadn't met Miranda and the others, that he wouldn't know the things he did. She decided there was no way he could fabricate such a detailed and accurate story. Miranda had also told her about her prior experiences, and they had discussed them thoroughly. Once Charles and Olivia had determined they were on the same side, he asked her again for Miranda's location. She brought a group of students here a few days ago, Olivia said, but then she went with a group of the military people when they left. She said she was going to continue looking for survivors, and that there were still lots of people in the world who needed her help. She came back briefly yesterday. We had a fight, and then she left. I don't know where she went after that, or when she's coming back. Charles felt a little helpless. He knew Miranda had a good heart, and would have insisted on bringing the students there to make sure they were safe. As a teacher, she would have seen it as her responsibility to do so, but he hadn't expected her to drop the students at the safe zone and immediately go out again. He wasn't sure what to make of her decision, because he wasn't the sort of person who could feel empathy in the way she did. He was inclined to think she was foolish, but he could understand that she had felt morally obligated to help. Now that they were on the subject, Olivia found herself reflecting on her and her cousin's shared past. I grew up with Miranda, she said. She was more of an older sister than a cousin. We were really close when we were younger, but when I grew up, my family and hers had a huge disagreement about the division of some property. I was forced to follow my destiny and go into the family business, and she was always determined to become a teacher. Alice sighed in sympathy. That's awful, she said sadly. To To think that you could be torn apart because of a family matter. I can't believe a family would split up over some property. Just because our families turned against each other doesn't mean that we did, Olivia assured her. Once I had control of the family businesses, Miranda and I didn't see any reason to remain at odds. The reason she didn't want to return to the fortress is because she likes being a teacher. Charles nodded. He understood why there had never been any news of Miranda in his previous life. People like her were the ones who had died in the early stages of the apocalypse. But since he was around this time, along with several other people who should have died, he hoped there was a chance to change Miranda's fate. I mean, we still don't see eye to eye on everything, Olivia continued. She feels that the paranormal should be using their powers to help others, but I feel that the most important thing is to strengthen my own power. Recounting their disagreement filled her with sadness. She and Miranda had once been practically inseparable, but they had always been extremely different people. Once the disaster had struck, it had turned their bond to ashes. Initially, when she had seen her cousin again, Olivia had thought the two of them could support each other and overcome the crisis together. But it had soon become evident that, despite their shared trauma, they were still at odds in their ways of thinking. Alice sighed. When Miranda saw several of the students have breakdowns and jump off the building, I thought it changed her as a person. I thought it had hardened her. Miranda had changed in the same way everyone else had. She had learned to make tough choices, and she had realized that she couldn't save everyone. But when she saw instances where she could be of assistance, she was still willing to help others. Maybe it was because she felt guilty, Charles suggested. Perhaps that's why she's so willing to risk her life. Some people just shine brighter than others. I don't think it's because they're naive or they've never seen evil. It's because they have seen the evil in people and still believe there's hope. He admired Miranda very much, and he respected her for wanting to save lives. In his previous life, he had been somewhat similar. Even though he had seen that humans were capable of great evil, he had never given up hope in humanity. Unlike Miranda, however, he couldn't bear to let his family risk their lives along with his. This time, his only concern was how to defend the people he cared about. Everything else took a back seat. Noticing Olivia's melancholic expression, Charles said, "You know, even though the two of you have different views, it doesn't mean you can't work together." She frowned. "What does that mean?" "She wants to do everything she can to help others," he replied, "but you'd prefer to pursue your own strength and use your power to make yourself stronger. If we could build a survival base and work together, then she could save the survivors, and you could help manage them." Olivia was confused. "A survival base?" she asked. "What's that?" He hadn't meant to let the term slip. After all, the concept of a survival base hadn't yet become popular. In his previous life, it had taken a long time for humans to understand their importance. Realizing that, he quickly corrected his misstep. "Like in the movies, when people are stuck on islands and stuff," he clarified. "We can build a place for the survivors to settle down and rebuild. It will have sustainable food and water, and be able to resist the dangers of the outside world." "Isn't that the same as living here?" Olivia asked. "We have the people from the military to protect us. How could there be a safer place than this?" "If the military really could protect everyone," Charles said, "then why would they need to recruit people to defend the fortress? Also, there are more fights for food and many missing people these days. Do you think the military can control those things forever? They've done their best, but they can only keep it going for so long." Olivia was silent. She wasn't a fool, but she also didn't want to admit that their current model wasn't sustainable in the long term. Deep in her heart, she wanted to believe that the place she lived was safe, so she had chosen to overlook the ever-increasing number of issues that the military was facing in their attempt to retain order. But she had to acknowledge that Charles had a valid point. The fortress wasn't the paradise she wanted it to be, and one day, the walls that had protected her for so long would come crashing down. Besides, the army had other pressing concerns. Once the supplies started to run low, no one could guarantee that every soldier would continue to put the lives of civilians first. It was time for her to take her head out of the sand and start planning. "What do you think we should do?" she asked Charles. "If we establish ourselves with too much authority," he said, "then I'm sure it will make the military suspicious. We don't want to alert them to what we're planning, or let them realize that we don't want to rely on their leadership forever. We need to wait it out until just before the military can't keep order. After that, we'll change the fortress into a survival base. Then we'll tell the army that we've noticed civil order is failing and that we want to share the burden with them." Olivia gave him a meaningful look. "Okay," she said. "I believe you." The trust she had in Charles wasn't based on his character or on what she thought of him as a person, but on his performance over the past few days. His conduct had thoroughly convinced her that he could do anything he put his mind to. "We need to train as many people in the Alliance as possible," Charles said, "but it must be a gradual process. I don't want the military thinking we're planning a coup, because they'll think we're descending into anarchy." He knew that if they were too obvious, it would create panic among the people, and if everyone sensed that the military was failing and began to revolt, then it would undo all the good work the army had done. Also, if they thought Charles was trying to usurp power, they would certainly want to eliminate him as a threat. Although Olivia didn't have any clue about Charles's true motivations, she knew one thing. If she wanted to be left standing at the end of whatever revolution was about to happen, then she would bet on Charles being the man to help her. Soon, members of the Dawn Alliance began to appear covertly at Charles's residence, and he trained them in small groups. The process went smoothly, and they didn't encounter too many obstacles. The military had no interest in their activities because they'd been kept busy by a sudden outbreak of paranormal robberies within the fortress. Most paranormals had a great deal of moral integrity, and many of them even thought of themselves as saviors. But there were a few of them who used their power to do whatever they wanted. Charles despised the rogues, and he took out a large group of them himself when he was certain no one was looking. A few days later, several others were eradicated by the military. But as the rate of hunger increased, there were still many people willing to break the moral code of conduct within the fortress. Some paranormals weren't willing to risk their lives battling monsters outside the city, or to travel to unknown places to search for resources. They didn't see why they should do such things when it was so much easier to simply snatch food from the mouths of the weak. On the other hand, the Dawn Alliance saw a surge in supporters due to the thefts. Many people came to the group because they were being bullied by the paranormals, and once they were given the opportunity to join, most of them were happy to stay and help where they could. Charles and the others ensured that their followers were taken care of, and they took the protection of their members seriously. The military received some complaints from wayward paranormals about Charles's actions, but the soldiers had noticed an obvious improvement in the security measures of the fortress. They recruited some of the Alliance members into the military defense team and turned a blind eye to the rest. It also became apparent that several factions had formed inside the fortress. These were groups who went outside the fortress to find food together, and they would hunt together and take care of each other. Such groups were usually small, because it was difficult to manage large numbers in the outside world and ensure the safety of all their members. There were two primary forces that had more supporters and better resources than anyone else. One was Charles's Dawn Alliance, and the other was the Neal family. The Neal family was an ancient martial arts family, and they allowed other people to join them as members. Apart from providing cultivation methods, they also gave their supporters some martial arts training, which attracted many people who were brave enough to take on monsters. But if a new member wanted to learn advanced martial arts techniques, then they were expected to utilize their skills in battle. This idea wasn't appealing to a lot of people. They were happy to forage for food, but not necessarily to fight the monsters. Issues began to arise when the Dawn Alliance members' residences were desecrated. The Neal family had decided to claim a large area of land for themselves on the west side of the fortress. They then expelled everyone who disobeyed their orders or refused to join their group, claiming that only their members could live there. Once the Neal family had set that precedent, several other paranormal groups began to follow suit. Fights broke out over so-called territory, and conflicts began to arise. At first, the military was unhappy about the arrangement, and they were forced to break up fights and restore order. But they were surprised to realize that, once the fortress had been divided into territories, there were far fewer occurrences of theft and random violence. Charles tried to explain the situation to some of the military guards. "People who want to survive are forced to seek the protection of a paranormal," he told them. "Paranormals don't tend to clash with each other, and the rogue ones were only targeting ordinary people because they knew they couldn't fight back. Since the defenseless people are now protected by other paranormals, the crime rate has dropped. He had noticed that the military often sought him out if there was an incident inside the fortress. If something went wrong, they often held him accountable, or else interrogated him for hours to determine whether he was the cause of the trouble. Barely a day went by where he wasn't subjected to several rounds of questioning about something that had nothing to do with him or his people. Alice became increasingly annoyed at the military's persistence. Finally, she couldn't take it anymore. "Don't you guys have anything better to do?" she demanded one day, when she saw a man questioning Charles outside his residence. "We've contributed significantly to the security around this place, and the army barely has anything to do anymore. So whenever there's a problem, why do you come straight to us instead of catching the people who did it?" "I don't blame you for being angry," the military guard said, "but we have to investigate these things, and whether you like it or not, you have a lot of people looking up to you." The man smiled at her sympathetically. He knew Charles wasn't doing anything to disrupt the peace within the fortress, but that didn't change the fact that he was also a loose cannon and was known to be somewhat unstable. He could potentially go off at any time, and he was considered dangerous due to his number of followers. Charles tried to smooth things over. "Don't worry," he told Alice. "I don't have anything to hide. They can come by whenever they want. After all, I'm not doing anything wrong." She rolled her eyes. "Just because you're not doing anything wrong, that doesn't mean they have the right to show up whenever they want," she said testily, but she didn't object further. Before he left, the military guard said, "Look, we believe you're a good guy, Charles, but we'd also like you to trust us. I know things are different now, but we in the military are doing everything we can to restore order as much as possible. You'll thank us one day when everything is back to normal." Charles could read between the lines. What the man meant was, please don't do anything irrational, because when order returns to its full capacity, everyone will be held accountable for their actions. Charles shook the man's hand and said, "I know you and the others mean well, but you'll never accomplish it," he thought. It was a dark era, full of despair. People could hide away and hope for brighter days all they wanted, but he knew no one could make the darkness disappear. Another 3 days passed, and the Dawn Alliance's influence grew, and their numbers swelled. They amassed more resources, built alliances with other groups, and expanded their territory exponentially within the fortress. Only the Neal family could rival them when it came to numbers. The only advantage the military had above either faction was their firepower, but their threat was minimal. During the 3 days of cultivation, Charles's strength had increased from Tier 3 to Tier 5. Alice had achieved an incredible feat and jumped from Tier 3 to Tier 8, far surpassing Charles. But Charles didn't measure his strength according to levels, and there was a reason his rate of improvement was slow. Many of his methods could only be used by a Tier 5 paranormal. The Extract Amulet was all-encompassing, and it was equivalent to a paranormal of all attributes. It also afforded him the precious ability of energy space. Lena had used her time to develop her powers to a level where she could kill zombies and some monsters. She didn't initially like the feeling that came with the increased power, but eventually, she grew accustomed to the change. Charles felt sorry that his sister was so uncomfortable with her power, but he also knew that acceptance was a stage everyone had to reach on their own. Without the ability to fight, he knew Lena was as good as dead. He spent the day collecting resources. When Alice and Sylvia accosted him outside his residence, he wasn't surprised. "You've been avoiding us all day," Alice accused him. "Are you planning on sneaking away or something?" She narrowed her eyes in suspicion. She knew him too well, and she also knew that if she didn't call him out, then he wouldn't tell her anything. Charles didn't want to lie to her. He looked at her seriously and asked, "Do you remember what I said to the guard outside the fortress this morning?" Alice cast her mind back to that morning. Finally, she said, "Didn't you tell the guard you'd seen a swarm of bugs or something?" She suddenly looked worried. "Are you expecting the bugs to come here?" She considered Charles's actions earlier that day. He had returned to the fortress early in the morning, which was unusual for him. She wondered if he had sensed then that there was something wrong. "I don't know," he said, "but I do know one thing, and that's to never let your guard down when it comes to nature. At the rate the swarm was traveling earlier, they ought to arrive outside the fortress within hours, so we need to be ready." Why don't you remind the guards? Sylvia suggested. I already warned them about the insects, he said, shrugging, and they didn't take it seriously. I'm not going to nag them about it. Either they've prepared themselves or they haven't. It's not my job to make sure they're safe. If anything, it's the other way around. He remembered how the mutated insects had attacked the fortress during his previous life, but he couldn't tell the guards that. All he could do was pretend that he had discovered the insects that morning, and then warn them of the potential danger. Since he had done that, his conscience was clear. He couldn't admit to them that he knew the information because he had lived through the experience before. Because not only would they never believe him, but they would think he had gone mad. Even if someone did believe him, there was no telling how that might affect his current life. Alice and Sylvia fell silent. They knew Charles's intuition had a long history of being correct, and they also knew he had been able to protect them from most things that had come their way. But they were aware he wasn't infallible, and did have moments of weakness. They couldn't expect him to shield them from every danger out there. I need you both to gather everyone from the Dawn Alliance and have them stick together around the communal rooms, he instructed. If people want to sleep, then tell them to do it in the communal dormitories. I'm going to go and see whether these mutated insects have arrived near the gate. If they have, then we need to wake everyone we can to mount a defense and escape. Both women nodded, and then Charles headed in the direction of the gate. When he returned, it was with the grave news that the insects were approaching the fortress at a rapid rate. They would arrive within the hour. He recalled his previous life, when the swarm attack had turned the entire fortress into hell on earth and caused countless casualties. It had also sparked the military's realization that they couldn't save everyone. It had been the beginning of the end. Charles hated that he was going to use such a catastrophe to enhance his own authority and establish himself as the leader of the entire fortress. But he pacified his guilt by reminding himself that he didn't have much choice. With that in mind, he quietly approached the area controlled by the Neal family. Because the family had to maintain their reputation, they had offered the military many of their people to patrol the fortress wall. They had figured it would help maintain the safety of their people, and it also meant their guards were the ones who oversaw anyone leaving or entering the fortress. Their contribution wasn't entirely due to their altruism, however. They had sparked outrage inside the fortress due to a PR campaign that had gone badly wrong. They had tried to win people's hearts by promising everyone an hour of free observation time, where they said they would use one of their paranormals to keep an eye on everyone inside the fortress, giving the rest of the paranormals an hour off. Unfortunately, their medicinal paranormal was bitten by a medicinal mutated zombie. Then the infected paranormal had managed to breach the fortress, resulting in several dozen casualties. The Neal family had finally managed to suppress the matter, but it had caused numerous losses and a great deal of resentment from the rest of the people within the fortress. Since then, they've been trying to rebuild their reputation. Charles had decided to approach their side of the fortress because he knew that this was the first area where the mutated bugs would appear. He put on some black clothes to better avoid the Neal family's patrols, intending to climb over their section of the wall to keep a lookout. But when he arrived, he saw that the gate had been left open. Are they crazy? He thought, furious. They've actually left the gate open. His eyes filled with anger. Leaving the gate open at night was practically suicidal. He was particularly annoyed because it wasn't only their members they had put at risk. It was everyone in the fortress. He watched as a few cars entered the city and stopped outside the Neal family compound. When they emerged, the cars' occupants were greeted warmly by the Neal family. A dignified middle-aged man stepped out of the first car. "Thank you for your hard work, everyone," he said. "I hear that you haven't taken control of this place yet. Is Charles still giving you trouble?" Charles immediately disliked the man. He knew who he was. George Neal, the head of the Neal family, and one of the people responsible for Kevin's death in Charles's previous life. George was ambitious and ruthless in his pursuit of power, and he was also highly traditional. He claimed to want to be closer to the ancient era in terms of his clothing and living environment, and he liked to present himself as some kind of holy man. But he drove a modern car, so he was clearly a hypocrite. A young man shook George's hand. "As head of the family, we've asked you here to help us," he said. "The Dawn Alliance is too powerful, and we can't do anything to Charles without setting off a bloody conflict. After all, this place is still under the control of the military, so we can't cause too much trouble." Charles smirked as he listened. If these people started a fight with him, then they would suffer, far worse than any of Charles's people would. Although the Neal family had a few members who were already immune to the power of firearms, the majority of them were still susceptible to great injury. So unless they wanted to walk into a massacre, it would be better for them to remain quiet. George snorted. I can't believe one little brat can render so many of you powerless. Tell me where he lives and I'll have Shadow kill him. Shadow was the name of George's personal guard. He specialized in assassination techniques and was responsible for dealing with George's enemies. Obviously, since Charles had overheard the discussion, any attempt Shadow made to surprise him would be completely ineffective. Sebastian turned pale with fright. George, you can't, he interjected. If you kill Charles, then the military will never let it go. There are too few of us who can defend ourselves against firearms. If there's a conflict, the military will use it as an excuse to take us all out. Do you think I'm so stupid as to leave evidence behind? George snapped. Sebastian lowered his head. Of course I trust Shadow's abilities, he clarified. But the military had changed how they do things. They may not need evidence. George was livid, but he remained calm. He knew Sebastian was making sense. Even Charles, who'd been doing so-called good deeds, was on a military watch list. He shuddered to imagine how hard the military would come down on the Neal family if they took out the only other influential faction leader. If they tried anything excessive, he expected the military would fire first and ask questions later. They were just waiting for an excuse. If that's the case, George said, then let's just wait and see. Suddenly, the meeting was interrupted by a loud buzzing sound. When they heard the strange sound behind them, the members of the Neal family turned to see several giant insects the size of a human head flying in their direction. Sebastian took a step forward and said, I'll deal with these things. He pulled a saber from a sheath at his waist and rushed toward a few bugs. George simply nodded and said nothing. He was perfectly capable of taking care of a few mutated bugs, but he didn't want to dirty his clothes trying to kill them. If Sebastian wanted to take care of them, then George was more than happy to allow him to do so. Sebastian was an outstanding fighter, and he swung his sword expertly. In less than 10 seconds, all the bugs had been reduced to piles of body parts on the ground. A stray bug was killed by one of George's guards, but the bugs were tenacious. Sometimes, even if their heads were cut off, their bodies could still move. They had to be severed in two across their abdomens to be killed. The Neal family's guards had accumulated a lot of combat experience by guarding the city walls, so they were familiar with different monsters, including mutated bugs. I'm sorry I missed one, Sebastian apologized to George. George was pleased with Sebastian's performance, and he looked at the young man approvingly. The family is lucky to have a young man like you, he remarked. It's a sign of the family's strength. I can't imagine why you felt the need to apologize. Nothing you've done can be worse than that good-for-nothing Kevin. Sebastian was delighted to be praised by the head of the family, and he was certain that meant he was destined to rise steadily within the ranks. His greatest ambition was to one day lead the family himself. Just as they were about to continue inside, some more bugs flew into the fortress. Quick, close the gate, Sebastian ordered. I'll deal with these. Clearly, he attributed the appearance of the bugs to the fact that the gate was open. A few lesser members of the family sprang into action and closed it. Once it was sealed, Sebastian expertly destroyed the bugs that had already managed to get in. Irritated by the disturbance caused by the insects, the family saw no reason to continue their discussion outside. George followed the others into the Neal family's residence. What they didn't know was that, outside the city, more bugs were swarming in their direction. Many of the insects with stronger flying abilities had already succeeded in flying over the fortress wall. The bugs that could only fly at a low altitude had instead landed on the wall itself and had begun to climb it with their sticky feet. Now and then they beat their wings and launched themselves forward. Unaware of the impending danger, a few members stationed on the wall were talking to each other complacently. So George is finally here, one of them said conversationally. Those who were powerful in the past are even more so now, his colleague replied. Now that the core members of the family are here, Charles will be dead within a week. I heard George could break a metal plate with one kick, the third man said. He could even use his muscles to stop bullets. I wonder how powerful he is these days. That's right, the first man said excitedly. All those snooty paranormals with their awakened superpowers think of themselves as gods. But when George makes a move, they'll see what true power is. The three of them laughed. This place will become the Neal family's fortress. The guards began to envision how the fortress would look once it came under the Neal family's full control. As they began to discuss the potential changes they would like to see, a black bug used the cover of the night to crawl onto one of the guards' necks. Then it opened its pincer-like mouth and snapped. The guard didn't even have the time to cry out. He covered his bleeding neck with one hand and lurched forward in fright. He couldn't speak. His companions, who were still chatting, quickly noticed his miserable state, and they froze in fear. Once the bug had opened a wound, a few more bugs swarmed the guard. Others finally made it over the fortress wall, one after another, and attacked the remaining guards. "Quick, run!" a member of the patrol team shouted. Then he turned around and ran without looking back. He raced in the direction of the Neal family's compound, and many of the surrounding guards joined him. There were so many bugs that it was impossible for them to manage the numbers without reinforcements. One man who had fallen behind suddenly felt a pain in his thigh. A bug had managed to bite into it, leaving a huge wound. Blood seeped from it, and he crashed to the ground. He called out for his colleagues to help him, but they barely glanced at him. Within moments, he was accosted by even more insects. His screams finally appealed to one of his colleagues, who turned back with the intention of trying to help. He debated for a moment whether he should keep running to safety, but he finally decided to do the honorable thing. But before he could take 2 steps back, he felt a heavy thud on his head. Several bugs had already landed and opened their mouths. The shrill screams woke many people from their sleep. "What's going on? It's the middle of the night. Why are you shouting? Go to sleep!" Disgruntled shouts from sleepy family members quickly issued from nearby rooms. A few people came out to confront those who had woken them. Then the cries of those people joined the exclamation of the guards. "Bugs! Huge bugs! Run!" When they saw bugs as big as balloons, they ran for their lives. Along the way, they woke up more sleeping people. More people were beginning to realize that something was wrong, but when they went out, they only saw a black swarm of insects. In the darkness, it was impossible to count the number. The swarm attacked, and the fortress experienced the first disaster in its history. As soon as Sebastian had killed the first batch of insects, Charles had turned around and run away. He wasn't afraid of them individually, but he knew he couldn't manage all of them on his own. The sheer number of them was enough to intimidate even the strongest warrior. Since the disaster was occurring in the fortress exactly as scheduled, he knew he had to deal with it quickly. As he ran back to his district, he sent a signal to Alice, asking her to inform everyone they were under attack. As soon as Alice received the news, she woke Charles's people. She wasn't familiar with everyone in the Alliance, and she didn't even know how many of them there were, so she started by waking the people around her. She began with Lena, Harper, and the others. "Alice," Lena grumbled sleepily. "What are you doing?" "Do you remember when your brother told us about the bugs he found?" Alice asked quickly. "They've swarmed the fortress. You need to get up, get your stuff, and get out." Lena shivered in disgust. She had seen how terrifying those monsters were in her last interaction with them. Casualties on Charles's side hadn't been high, but those who had followed other paranormals had been in a terrible state. Lena had doubled her efforts to increase her fighting skills precisely because of the terrifying insects. "Really?" Lena asked. "Then we need to hurry." Harper and Blair found that most of the things in the house had already been packed. They didn't point this out, but simply put everything into the armored car. It was fortunate for Charles that Lena hadn't noticed the preparations, otherwise she would have asked him to explain himself. "I heard Charles telling the military guys about those bugs today," Harper said, "but I didn't think they'd really come into the fortress." She wondered how Charles seemed to have known the bugs were coming. Once the car had been loaded, Alice went to wake the others, but instead of waking them individually, she used her powers to splash their faces with water. Before Tommy, Hugh, and the others had time to get angry, she shouted, "Get up! Charles has orders!" Alice had established herself as an authority during the preceding days, and she didn't waste time mincing her words. "Is something wrong?" Tina asked, rubbing her eyes. Very wrong, Alice replied. There are bugs coming. You all need to wake up. When she woke the Dawn Alliance's paranormals, they were also less than pleased. If they hadn't known Alice was with Charles, then they would have been furious and unwilling to listen. Olivia, though, sided with her right away. Come on, guys, she shouted. If Alice says there's danger, then it's true. A blonde-haired paranormal named Dean sneered at Alice. Even if there is danger, why do you need to wake up so many people? Can't you guys handle it? Many of the others had fought monsters during the day, so they agreed with Dean, thinking they shouldn't have to work a double shift. Just as Lena raced to defend Alice from an onslaught of complaints, Charles strode into the dormitory. If you think you can handle these things on your own, he said, his voice icy, then by all means go out and get killed. That was enough to rouse the remaining paranormals from their beds. The bugs have arrived from the west, Charles said. Everyone pack up and prepare for battle. If we can't beat the things, then we need to flee. By this point, they could all hear faint screams coming from the other side of the fortress, and many of the Alliance members finally realized the seriousness of the situation and felt bad for shouting at Alice. But the paranormal named Dean was still unwilling to admit he had been wrong. Isn't it just some bugs? He asked. Do we really need to make such a big fuss? I met a swarm of them today, and it didn't take much to kill them. He wasn't being deliberately defiant. He simply didn't like being wrong, so he found it hard to back down. Well said, Dean, someone said. Go get him, Dean, called someone else. Dean was relatively popular, and since he was a good fighter, he'd gathered a few subordinates. He felt a little smug as they encouraged him. Olivia threw more cold water on them. You can't deal with the bugs if you're half asleep, she said. Dean was furious. He was about to say something when Charles interrupted, calling, The bugs are here. Everyone stay alert. A black bug had found its way onto Dean's foot during the conversation. It bit down hard, making him cry out in pain. Ah, my foot! He screamed. A few more of the bugs entered the room and began to attack everyone. A fireball appeared in Dean's hand, and he threw it at the insect that was attacking his foot. Then he vented his frustration on several of its friends. Soon, the insects had burned to death. In the lull, a light element paranormal took the opportunity to treat Dean's foot, stopping the bleeding and preventing him from being permanently disabled. Would you rather these things had come at you in your sleep? Olivia asked them all. Dean still refused to back down. I could have taken them, he insisted petulantly. There are more coming, Charles shouted. He had barely managed to warn them all when another enormous swarm descended upon them.